Good morning. It's February 4th, 2019, the fourth day of Black History Month, and here we present the third episode of the Afrolantican Legal Academy's presentation of Afrolantican Jurisprudence. In this particular episode, we're going to talk specifically about the concept of MAAT, M-A-A-T, the goddess Maat, and due process of law. You've probably heard of a lot of Egyptian cosmology, the gods and goddesses. You've probably heard of Maat. You've seen her with her arms outstretched like a falcon or an eagle with the golden feathers and the scales. And so we've often heard or talked about, or probably you've read about her and Egyptian spirituality and its relation to the West, whether it's superior or whether it's better or whatever, whether it's complete or whether it's the origination. You probably also hear a lot about how Egyptian gods and goddesses were the forerunners to Christianity and Islam and Judaism. So this is going a different direction. Here we're not talking about spirituality. We're going to talk more so about technological and political achievement and where Maat and the connection between the spiritual world Maat and truth, justice, order, harmony, balance, and what that meant for Egyptian legal systems and therefore African legal systems, because as we're also going to mention, regardless, we're going to talk about, number one, the Old Kingdom Egypt period, which is when it's at its height, number one, and also when it is basically directly emanating from the African interior. But also we'll talk a little bit about how, according to Bruce Williams of the Oriental Institute and some positive evidence, Nubia is older, and that the legal framework that the Egyptians followed was already in place prior to the dynastic period and probably emanates from the south. So that, and we know that from the south, from Nubia, is where we basically get the dispersal of culture, High Nile Valley culture, to the rest of Africa, right? So while we do praise Egypt and while we do defend its African characters, particularly in the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and parts of the New Kingdom, we do want to make clear that the cultural jump-off place, or the where we find cultural diffusion, is usually from Nubia and the kingdoms of Kush, Kerma, Napata, Meroe, that lasted all the way into the Christian era, and then migrations from there spread throughout Africa, west, south, central, etc. So again, this is the third meeting. Again, we start this purposely to kick off Black History Month and try to do these daily exercises. It's a little ambitious. We kind of missed yesterday. We watched the Super Bowl. Not really a Patriots fan, so I guess I was going for the Rams, but I'm down with the Eagles. E-A-G-L-E-S. Eagles. All right, well, we're going to put that to the side like they put Kaepernick to the side and move forward. So again, please, before we get started, please go to the YouTube channel, subscribe to Afrolantica.com, the YouTube channel, like the videos or dislike the videos, or please put comments in the comment section, questions, concerns, comments that hopefully that I might be able to address. I'm also the director of the Economic Justice Law Review. Look out for blurbs on that, Facebook, Twitter, etc. And please, if you don't mind, go to Amazon.com and buy the book Taxes, Death, and Trouble: How Starve the Beast Tax Cuts Created the Black Lives Matter Movement. That's my latest book. Taxes, Death, and Trouble: How Starve the Beast Tax Cuts Created the Black Lives Matter Movement. Okay, so now this video series is explicating my next book, Afrolantican Jurisprudence, basically a look at Afrocentric legal history and its extraordinary commitment to equal protection of law. And so we're reviewing, so we're going over the different chapters. Episode 1, we did a introduction of all the several chapters of how we're going to go for 6,000 years of African history, from Nubia and Egypt, Kemet and Kush, throughout Ghana, Mali, Songhai, and all the rest, all the way to the present day and its relation to present day critical race theory. And all that culminates into my proposal for a constructive race theory based on what I call racially asymmetric market imperfections as a mechanism to expand the concept of equal protection within American jurisprudence. I know that's a mouthful. You probably fell asleep right there, but the whole purpose of this video series is to explain how I get there. Right? In order for you to understand why I think that is the better construct for American jurisprudence, I agree with critical race theorists that we need to expand the concept of equal protection, but I offer a way that's a little different than you'll find in law schools, even amongst black theorists or so-called critical so-named critical race theorists. So that's the whole point here. We did a review first. Our second episode, we talked about the pre-colonial states of Africa, the several, over 20 pre-colonial states that governed over the entire territory of Africa, how vast it was prior to European colonization, to defeat the idea that we did not have law and governance in ancient Africa. Not only did we have it, it was very intense and very modern and a lot more sophisticated than other parts of the world at that time. And so to remind everyone, and we're going to show again how Egypt and other African states as far back as 5,000 years ago were very complicated legal apparati with the state. And when we're talking about state, again, we're talking about a jurisdiction, an area of land over which a particular ethnic group is governing several provinces, each with their own mini government, so a federation, and it's controlled basically through taxation and also military. I mean, basically, when we're saying the non-payment of taxation has been an active rebellion for 6,000 years, right? It is the sine qua non of the state. All right, so here's the question. Is your heart as light as a feather? Is your heart as light as a feather? If you've heard that phrase before, it is from the trial of the dead, or basically the trial of people's souls after they die in the Book of the Dead, or more specifically, the book of coming forth towards the light, from the darkness towards the light. It's an ancient Egyptian text on how to get basically into heaven or the underworld, where Osiris reigns after one passes, and one has to recite the negative confessions, and your soul is tested against the feather of MAAT, and your heart has to be lighter than a feather, guiltless, right, carefree, right, because you are more or less sinless. Before the concept of sin, specifically, again, we have this issue of the argument of the negative confessions. Now, let me give you a couple caveats before we get started. Let me offer you a couple limitations about what we're talking about. Number one is time. As much as I want to give you the legal history of Africa, and I want to do it not just to glorify Africa and Africans and black folks generally, I want to give you basically more or less a legal education so that you understand after this series just as much as about law as those that are coming out of law schools. Now, again, that's going to take a series of classes that we're going to do actual contracts, property, constitutional law, and all that. But for right now, we're doing a kind of liberal artsy thing to get the basics, almost like a political science approach, and historical and economic approach to law, to give you the basics before we move on to more intense legal terminology, because that's really what all law is. Law is a language. It's not really a different discipline. It's every child knows what fair is, but in the law, you have to say inequitable or some other 3-syllable words. It has to be 3 syllables in the law, at least. I'm kidding, but I'm not. So time is an issue because there's so much to give, right? There's so much to give. And then secondly, another limitation is expertise. I am not an Egyptologist. Nor am I a history professor when it comes to all of Africa. How I get here is through taxation. Again, I'm a tax law professor. Interesting thing is, I wrote a paper, or I was interested in how judges make decisions, and there's a interpretive regime called textualism. You'll hear about this term textualism if you ever go to law school, and you talk about how judges make decisions. They're supposed to stick to the text. And there was a judge that just passed, Justice Antonin Scalia, and he was what we call a formalist. However, he had a different style of formalism than most. When he talked about the founders, he talked about the founders of the United States and what the intent of the founders was in order how to interpret what the Constitution means when there's a dispute over what it requires, or what it prohibits, what it allows. And most people would say that formalists would say that you're trying to discern the intent of the founders on the situation, those that created the Constitution itself, the authors. Justice Scalia was a little different. Justice Scalia had a plain meaning or textualist approach that called for the justices of the Supreme Court to respect the understandings of the people who read the Constitution originally and those who voted and approved it, not the speaker, but the audience. Right? Their understanding is to dominate, and not what was in the minds of the authors. And to get that, he uses dictionaries. They use all types of other techniques to try to discern what was the quote-unquote plain meaning of the people of the United States rather than the founders. That's his brand of originalism. Clarence Thomas also claims to be this type of originalist. If you consider all conservatives originalists, there are distinctions among them, and this is one. So I had a question when I read this, not good or bad, but here was a question. Does it matter what slaves thought direct tax meant in the Constitution? There's a dispute over what direct tax means, and it's going to come to a head pretty soon with Elizabeth Warren and others promoting wealth taxes, right? And the argument that the direct tax, the prohibition against direct taxes without uniformity in the Constitution would prevent it. But that question means, what does it mean, and how do we determine what it means? Do we try to figure out what the founders thought it meant when in their heads, and which ones? Because there was a lot of authors to the Constitution. Do we talk about the people? Do we talk about what it means what direct tax means in the 21st century? Right, that is more of the progressive realist approach. Right, what does it mean to define it in a particular way? What is the consequence of a direct tax? And I would say that's modern, but even the first Supreme Court that dealt with the question in Hilton was more or less a realist, took a realist approach. So in other words, the point is there's different ways to approach a legal question, to answer it, right? What does direct tax mean? And so when it comes to Scalia's approach, my question was, does it matter what slaves thought direct tax meant? If we're going to try to figure out what the people of the United States thought something meant, all the people, everybody, right? That's what his theory requires. The next question: who are these people of the United States, and how are you going to figure out what they thought it meant? So yeah, going straight to the dictionary is one way, but it doesn't deal with all the problems or the issues concerned. So my question is, does it matter what enslaved Africans thought, or are their thoughts discounted by 3/5, like the Constitution kind of says, or is it discounted entirely? It seems to be discounted entirely because no one talks about it. And two, going back to now my original point about expertise, to answer the question, what would slaves have thought direct tax meant, right? Learned slaves. Like, let's deal with the fact that, again, we did not, a backwards people was not captured and then brought to civilization. Doctors, lawyers, and other folks, and I'm sure there's lots of common folks, soldiers, prisoners of war, maybe even criminals, who knows, were enslaved or sold into slavery. However, we also know kings, queens, princes, princes, princesses, governors, lawyers, doctors, and judges, etc., were also enslaved and brought over. The case of Equiano the African, Prince Abdul Rahman, the very learned folks that had studied in the schools of Timbuktu in Mali and Songhai at the time were enslaved and brought over to the Americas. And if you know about the Americas at that time, it was not a very learned place, particularly outside of New England. So even though you had a gentry in each state, in each colony, that probably was trained up in England, or perhaps attended Harvard since the 1600s, early 1700s or 17th century, most of the people were illiterate. Most of, not just the slaves, but white folks overseas were illiterate. So when we talk about the people of the United States, Africans, enslaved Africans, probably had as good a knowledge on what direct tax meant as anybody. So the question then becomes, what might it be? And so that was a question that I could not answer. And in order to be complete on that particular question and answering that particular question, it caused me to go ask my research assistants and librarians and do a lot of research myself to find, wow, let me go through African history to determine what were the tax systems of pre-colonial Africa. And voila, the actual information was in abundance. I know they say our history is hidden or stolen, but it's kind of hidden in plain sight. I was fortunate enough to have an occupation as a law professor that basically paid me to do this type of research, and not everyone has that opportunity. So this is the purpose of me collecting that information and bringing it out to you, even though no, I'm a tax lawyer more than an Africanist or historian, griot, or spiritual leader, any of those things, or Egyptologist. So as a matter of fact, if you're looking for even a preeminent expert in those issues, there is the director of the African American Studies program at Howard University, who is also a law professor. So there are combination Egyptologists and law professors out there. Dr. Greg Carr, a fantastic scholar and able heir to the legacies of Dr. Hilliard and Dr. John Henrik Clark, Joseph Ben Yakinen, etc. All right, so let's go. Let's get back to the subject at hand. Again, is your heart as light as a feather? This idea of due process in ancient Egypt and ancient Africa. So, is your heart as light as a feather? We're talking about a trial. Right, we're talking about, as Asa Hilliard would say, the world's first trials were documented in ancient texts, the pyramid text, the coffin text, the Book of the Dead, or as was also been said, the Book of the Coming Forth from Darkness to the Light. These texts showed trials in Egyptian mythology that basically on the one hand, illustrated their commitment to justice and law, and also became, for them, guideposts to guide their conduct in the future, to make sure that political organization and dispute resolution and all of that was done in a manner that produced an effective society. Right? So let's talk about this again, the Old Kingdom. We're going to use this to talk about law in Old Kingdom Egypt. So as we talk about Afrocentric legal history, we're talking at least 6,000 years ago, 4,000 BC. How can we be sure about 4,000 BC? The calendars. Egyptians created lunar and solar calendars, and we know that at least one of them dates back to 4000 BC. We know that the Nile Valley was populated long before that. The Bedouin civilizations. There's lots of peoples that lived in the Nile Valley even before there was a Kemet, even before there was a Tasseti or Nubia. There were lots of people in the Sahara before it dried up, and some people even think as the Sahara slowly dried, more and more people condensed towards the Nile Valley. Now again, that's from the east and the west. From the south, the source of the Nile is down in Uganda, Ethiopia, flowing through into Sudan, and today is Sudan, but now, or back in the day, it would be Nubia. And it flows all the way through Egypt, all the way to the Mediterranean, right? One of the world's longest, that and the Amazon being the world's longest rivers. And the idea that civilization flowed down the river, right, from the source of the Nile out into the Mediterranean. That's where people would have been flowing from, where towns and cities along the Nile would spring up way back through thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago, leading up to a point where we said that King Narmer, the first pharaoh of the Egyptian dynasty or Kemet, comes up from the south. The land that's called Upper Egypt, or the higher elevation of Egypt that's in the south, conquers the lands that are in Lower Egypt, those near the Mediterranean, near the Delta, where Cairo and all that is now, close to Israel, modern day Israel and Palestine now. Conquered that and created Egypt, the uniting of the two lands, right? And that old kingdom lasts for 6 dynasties. Again, a dynasty is a series of pharaohs, all emanating basically from the initial queen mother. There may her daughters may become new queen mothers during this dynastic period that could last either a small time or it could last hundreds of years, depending on how many successions occur. But whenever someone new outside of the family becomes a pharaoh, or the king or the queen, that becomes a new dynasty. So oftentimes we'll see a Egyptian dynasty start to wane, and sometimes a vizier, the prime minister, becomes the new pharaoh, and that will start a new dynasty, because that vizier was not born of the queen mother. And even if that reign is quote unquote legitimate, it will still start a new dynasty. So just because we have a new dynasty doesn't mean we have a down period in Egypt. However, after the 6th dynasty, yes, we do have a first intermediate period. An intermediate period, we mean the Upper and Lower Egypt broke apart again, right? That Upper Egypt that no one pharaoh or king governs the whole thing anymore. So in the first 6 dynasties, that's what's called the Old Kingdom, where Egypt is united. It sees itself as its own, slightly distinct from Nubia to its south, who they call Tasseti, right? There are periods when they're together, but there's also periods when they are not, right? They may see themselves as Africans, but just because they see themselves as Africans and distinct from peoples outside of Africa does not mean that they were always on friendly relations. They share many things as far as their mythologies and religions, and we'll argue that their political and legal structures were also similar, but they did in fact see themselves as people somewhat distinct from Nubia. We'll talk about the gods Osiris and Seti when it comes to that. Now, the first 6 dynasties are the most impressive. Now, there's others, the 11th, the 12th, the 18th, the 19th. Those dynasties are very great as far as empire building is concerned, as far as ruling all the way from Kenya all the way up to Syria. Those later dynasties can lay claim to that. However, The original six dynasties get the credit for the massive, massive building projects that we 6,000 years later don't even entirely understand how they did it. When we It's amazing in order to create pyramids of such mathematical precision. And let me say something about the pyramids. We have a habit, and again, this is a Eurocentric thing. We have a habit of only showing them as ruins, as if we couldn't, through computer generation, show them in all their splendor, or even back in the day, just paint them, or when we depict them. They weren't just stone. A sandy stone. They were painted. They were bejeweled. They gleamed from miles and miles and miles away. And so the reflection of the sun and the stars and the moon, all the things. I mean, just it's hard to fathom how spectacular the pyramids were, and it's also hard to fathom how spectacular the Sphinx. And to know that the Sphinx was a representation. There were so many little. You could have a little Sphinx in your house, right? So many statuettes of the things. I mean, these were just absolutely great, great, great builders and architects. And we'll talk about the grand architect Imhotep, who led the charge into this world, who was also the prime minister and more or less a judge or lawyer. Right? In order to have a society this complex, I want to be. It's not just the grandness of ancient Egypt ought to say something about the government that produces it. That it's hard to imagine the somewhat backwards people, or the idea that the pharaoh is just a god. Well, and that he controls everything and rules whimsically. I just don't understand how a people could be that mathematically precise on the one hand, and yet its governance structure be so primitive on the other, that there's just one person in charge of millions, and we're literally millions, and then he just create his word is law, and that somehow produces doctors, lawyers, architects, builders, philosophers, astronomers. And so I've always been interested in what are the specifics of the political organization that produces such a society, the economics of such a society. And it's interesting. I want to read you a quote from Aristide Theodorides, who wrote about law in ancient Egypt back in the 20th century. Oh my goodness, I'm sorry, you guys. Let me find my quote here. I don't want to hold you up too long. Okay, Theodorides says that Old Kingdom Egypt attained from the outset during the Old Kingdom a high level of institutional and juridical development, which was subsequently distorted by the intrusion of religious practices. In other words, he's saying there was a separation of church and state from the beginning that was violated later, but that Old Kingdom Egypt had a state apparatus entirely separate from religious practice, although at the same time governed by this idea of truth and justice represented by MAAT. Not only did, and going back to Theodorides, not only did Egypt not surpass this level in the later phases of her development, she may even perhaps have failed to reach it again despite the efforts of her rulers and thinkers. Again, not only did Egypt not surpass this level in the later phases of her development, so the highest level of their legal development was during the Old Kingdom, the first six dynasties, those which we know are predominantly African, those that we know are 1,000, sometimes perhaps 2,000 years before there's any invasion of the African continent or Egypt by outsiders or Mediterraneans, Greeks, Hyksos, Assyrians, Persians, etc. I also want to say this, we'll save this quote by James Wilson for a little bit later. But James Wilson also describes Old Kingdom government as an elaborate bureaucracy. An elaborate bureaucracy. That's a lot different than what you see on movies where there's a pharaoh that rules from on high, and then of course the priests, right? There's never government officials. There's a priesthood and these solemn folks that carry out the whims of the pharaoh, basically, sometimes even with magic. It's not magic. It's not magic. It's organization. It's political development. It's people thinking and putting in structures in place. And again, let me make sure we understand that Theodorides and John Wilson believe that these structures were so sophisticated that they couldn't have just appeared in the first dynasty, that they probably emanated from periods from the quote unquote pre-dynastic period. And let's add to that that Bruce Williams of the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago is very adamant that Nubia, or Ta Seti as is known, was a pharaonic dynastic state before Egypt, before Kemet, that it has priority. We'll talk about that much later. He has physical evidence that he believes proves it, and it's interesting how Afrocentric scholars, Bruce Williams would not be considered Afrocentric, but Afrocentric scholars tend to be reprimanded or discounted for lacking physical evidence. But then when a physical evidence does seem to suggest African priority and early genius, it's somehow discounted. We're also going to see that when we talk about these roles of precedent that govern legal cases and whether they're accepted. Okay, so now that I'm trying to establish how dope, how grand ancient Kemet was. So when you see these pyramids and whatnot, there's all the argument about the black. But what I want folks to understand is how many millions of people were in Egypt at the time, and that that besides electricity, take away electricity, and your everyday experience as a worker, as a lawyer, as a builder, as a farmer, or whatnot, was not that much different than it was today. And over which govern this idea of how everyone's going to treat each other is the concept of MAAT, M-A-A-T. Once again, the woman, the female goddess, she's like a falcon or an eagle with her arms outstretched, with the feathers by the scale, representing truth, justice, harmony, balance, order. Now, Egypt lasted over 3,000 years, and probably more than that. And to put that in context, understand the United States is only 300 years, hasn't even celebrated its 300th year as a state. From the Christian era to now is 2,000 years. And we're talking about Egypt lasting at least 3,000. Again, we said the solar calendar had to be created at least in 4,000 BC. So we're talking about a 4,000 year experience. And I say that to say that the concept of Maat and the Egyptian mythology changed and morphed through those times. It has a certain incredible consistency, but it also changed and morphed a lot. Now, but one of the concept that was extremely durable to this day, right? We see the representations of Maat to this day, 6,000 years, Maat. She's a goddess. And what's interesting about Egyptian, especially we're talking about equal protection law, and I mentioned that this is going to permeate our discussions, is the presence of women in Egyptian and African history in important positions. And there's no more important position than a goddess, right? You'll note that Egyptian gods and goddesses are paired. And even though we see that also in Greek, which followed and borrowed these things, you'll notice that Zeus is loose, right? Zeus gets with everybody, or there's a lot of promiscuity where there's just one to one to one to one, typically in Egyptian mythology. So you had Ra, who is basically the sun god, and Mut, which is the primordial ether, right? Jeb and Nut, right? Jeb, the sky god, Nut, the earth goddess, all right? Male and female. From there, you get, and their children are Osiris and Isis, Nephthys and Set, right? An interesting thing, again, Osiris is the god of Egypt. Set is placed all over. Sometimes His brother Set seems to be representing Lower Egypt, sometimes Upper Egypt, and represented with Baal, sometimes with Nubia. And so we see Set almost always placed in opposition, or as whether or not, on the one hand, the warrior god, right, or the rebellious god, right, the rebellious brother. So the relationship is very interesting, but it always seems to be male and female. Notice that when you see Egyptian statuettes, you almost always see pharaohs with their queens. You see male and females touching, right? It's very impressive, especially when you compare it to the artworks of other states in antiquity that don't seem to stress gender equity at all. But you see man, woman together and touching. Even the Ankh is male, the male phallus at the bottom, the woman at the top, self and others. Man, woman, self and others. Okay, so carrying forth that male and female god and goddess relationship, Maat is the goddess of truth, justice, harmony, balance, and order. The god of law is Thoth, right? And so you'll see this often, that the female represents the perfection of the concept, where the male represents action to try to reach that aspiration. And we see this again kind of played out in the statehood, where the queen mother represents the owner of the property, or the caretaker of the world for Osiris and Isis as their daughter, and that the men then are the action figures taking care and protecting this land that is kept pristine by the queen mother, or at least that's the ideal, right? Okay, and so through this Egyptian mythology, we see a commitment to due process, that there is the very first trial, right? You have the pyramid texts, the coffin text, the Book of Dead, that all describe the trial of Osiris, right? Osiris and Set are brothers. They much like Cain and Abel, Set kills Osiris, chops him up into pieces. Isis puts his body together, and they have an immaculately without his phallus, and that's why you have the obelisk in Alexandria and whatnot. And so without his phallus, he's still put together by Isis, who then has a child by Osiris immaculately, who becomes Horus, right? And again, you'll hear how that story resembles or predates Christianity and other religions who borrow from that story. The interesting thing is that Osiris and Set are judged, right? Set is judged by Anubis, right, down into the underworld. And this extends not just the trial of the gods. This trial scene is extended in the Book of the Dead to humans, right? So now for a human who dies, to get to the underworld, to be with Osiris, to be with the gods, your soul is placed on a scale. It is weighed against the feather of who? The feather of Maat. And your heart has to be, or your soul has to be lighter than a feather. And the judge in this case is Thoth, right? Judge is the Thoth. Anubis brings you down and then places you in front of Thoth. You must confess that you did not do, I have not done X, Y, and Z. I've not stolen from my neighbor. I've not said bad things about this person. Over 40 negative confessions that you must utter in order to reach basically heaven. Note that in the trial scene, Thoth is surrounded by 42 judges. 42. It so happens that Egypt, and we said Egypt is a state, as an estate is where a ruling class rules over several provinces. There are 42, or there were 42 provinces or nomes in Egypt. So the 42 judges around Thoth represent the 42 states, or the 42 provinces that have their own government, that have their own judges, that have their own political organization under the federal system, right? So That's how modern we're talking about. And so the Thoth, as the coordinator of all these 42 judges, is basically the prime minister, or Osiris's prime minister, his Supreme Court justice, his chief justice. And some of the roles, especially in the earliest of days, are combined like that. So from there, that's where we get, we can relate Thoth to Imhotep, right? Imhotep is the third dynasty vizier in Egypt. Again, the prime minister. So although there's a pharaoh, the pharaoh, we can't emphasize enough, the pharaoh doesn't just rule by himself. He doesn't. There's even a dispute as to what is meant by said by him being a god. Now, yes, when he says, "I'm the son of Horus," right, that he identifies, or the son of Osiris, or the son of Amun, and he identifies himself with this god for legitimacy, that does not necessarily mean that he can create law by edict. As a matter of fact, the evidence suggests that there's still a council of state. There's whether that council of state is dominated by the priests, or whether it's dominated by the local nomarchs, or whether it's dominated by other cabinet members of state that have their own constituency, is unclear. But it's pretty clear that Egyptian pharaohs, in most instances of their 3,000 years, did not have the power to just lay down law by edict, right? That it still had to represent the people. And then there is the question of whether those laws were codified, right? The positivist, hyper-positivism says that you don't have anything unless there's a record. So you can't say that there was law unless there was a code of laws, like the quote-unquote Code of Hammurabi in Western Asia. Now, there's a lot of dispute. There are mention of legal codes by several Greek scholars of antiquity, but as usual, when they say something positive about Africa, they're not to be believed, even though they're believed when they say something about something else. Or if they say something negative about Africa, then they're believed then. So I take the position that it really doesn't, that the presence or absence of a code is exaggerated one way or the other. I am comfortable with this massive amount of state political organization, totally comfortable with believing that it could not be run without law that's regularly applied and known by most, right? Maybe not all, but known by most. Just like today's society, ignorance of the law doesn't excuse you, which means we know that everybody doesn't know what the law is, but it still governs regularly, and the consequences from the breach thereof is regular. Okay, so the vizier is our primary cabinet level officer in the Egyptian dynasties. Imhotep is in the third dynasty, but again, the vizier exists from the very beginning, from the first dynasty, as the prime minister. There are other cabinet members, right? There's always a minister who basically deals with war. African kings don't fight. So the pharaoh is, in most instances, will take credit for victories far and wide, but typically and they're represented as holding heads and whatnot. But from what we know, they typically don't go into battle themselves and lead the charge. So there's definitely a cabinet level member who is in charge of armed forces that go out and about. And obviously that's a very important cabinet member who, if they get their own constituency, could possibly be a usurper to the crown. And I think it's fabulously impressive how little we see over a 3,000 year history, over 30 dynasty, and over 400 kings and pharaohs. There's very few stories of a military commander ousting the previous pharaoh through a coup. Now, of course, I'm sure it does in fact exist. It has happened, but you would think that it would happen more often. Now, again, there's there would also be other cabinet level ministers. We can't go through all of them. The granaries, when you're collecting taxes, at that time, before we're using a monetary exchange, and even in addition to a monetary exchange, most people paid their taxes by giving up what they produced on their farms, or if they're in their craft shops, or if they're a blacksmith, part of their wares. And you gave a portion to the state, who then collected it all, brought it to the central part of the state, and then redistributed pieces of it to all the other provinces that don't produce that particular thing. So that way, one province has its main staple, but then it gets a gift from the king and the central government of a piece of everybody else's, and vice versa. That's how we diversify the economy. And so there has to be an administration there. Right? We have to, first of all, have a census on each particular individual, right? How much they produce, where they live, how much land do they have. As a matter of fact, geometry, mathematics is pushed along mightily by the fact that the Nile inundates and overflows, and therefore to get my property back, my property, excluding all others, this is what I get to farm on, our community or our family. We have to know geometry in order to reshape, resize, and allow people to and regulate property, and then collect taxes from those thereon, to understand what yields ought to have been produced in this particular climate or this weather season, right? All of these things, this government apparatus is dealing with the science and irrigation to produce great amounts for the state, and taxation. All of this requires a government that you could not imagine could come from one person being the king and just issuing edicts about and governing through magic. This has a lot to do with state organization. There's also the idea that cabinet level officers could include religious officers. So the daughters of Ammon were often instilled as by the kings and pharaohs to rule over certain provinces, probably because they would be more trustworthy, especially when we recognize, again, this African interior, the Theban monarchy, the dynasties, when both Egypt, upper and lower together, typically come from the south, from the African interior, and that the north is typically populated more so by people from the Mediterranean and Western Asian that have been attracted to Egypt and have come to live there. So yes, of course, it's plenty of quote-unquote native Africans, but it's becoming a lot more cosmopolitan as there are people from other folks, and they bring their own gods, they bring their own ways. And it's interesting about Egypt being a 3,000-year tug of war on how to basically originalism and foundationalism from an African perspective, and trying to hold the fort that we see is almost the reverse situation that we see as black folks in the United States of America here, where we are the realists and white folks are the formalists, where it would have been the opposite in Old Kingdom Egypt, that the upper Egypt or the southern Egypt were the conservatives trying to maintain Egypt as it was. Okay, and one of the people, again, the cabinet level officer, one of the prime minister, the one who administers all the laws and whatnot, Imhotep. Of course, we know of others that are particularly famous too. Ptahhotep. We're going to talk about Ptahhotep in depth also, because there is another text called the Teachings of Ptahhotep. And there we have lessons on how to control and regulate the regulators, how to control the bureaucracy. I'm an administrative law professor. As a tax law professor, tax is an administrative law. And so it's a government action. How to make sure that government actions aren't arbitrary and capricious, right? How do we make sure that they follow the intent of the legislatures or the edict makers or the king, instead of just doing what they want to do, right? That's when the state seems to fall apart, when each person is, now I'm collecting taxes any way I want to, the way I want to, how I want to, and I may or may not give a piece back to the state. Once I get it, maybe they just can't catch me, right? How do we create a state apparatus that keeps cabinet regular officials honest, right? Honest and regular, and treat everyone the same, equal protection of the law, that everyone's treated the same, and that they're all and by a process, due process, that each and every person is entitled to, right? That's the connection between equal protection and due process. So these grand viziers, Imhotep, Ptahhotep, clearly there's those nomarchs that govern the provinces have their own cabinet level ministers within them. Anytime we talk about intermediate periods, it's often because those governors, their state apparatus becomes very strong and they can resist taxation from the state, and it changes. But meanwhile, again, Imhotep is not the only judge. Ptahhotep is not the only judge. There are courts everywhere, and they're trained, right? So Ptahhotep has his teachings of how to that they are supposed to follow. There's also what we instructions from the pharaoh. And as a matter of fact, let me give you now the quote from John Wilson about discretion and the cabining of discretion in ancient Egypt. According to Wilson, the king's charge to the vizier is very detailed. It insists upon the strictest impartiality and also directs that all of the vizier's judicial activity be carried out in conformance with the regulations and that everything be done in conformance with the precedent therefor. I don't think you can get a stronger statement about due process of law than that, right? Regulations and conformance with the precedent therefore. Precedent therefore. The reason why we have this vast library of cases and case studies is because in order to have equal protection, I need to have this writing explaining why your case is like everyone else's, or like the cases we decided before, or why it's not like the cases we decided before. Because when I decide, we're going to at least pretend that that wasn't just my whim, that I didn't do it just because I felt bad or felt good today, that I am restrained to dealing with you in the way other judges have dealt with other people, because it's not about me, it's about you and the state dealing with everybody fairly. We're going to talk about give you a quote from Ptahhotep later that's extraordinary when it comes to the creation of an administrative hearing. That may be our next episode when we talk about the teachings of Ptahhotep and an administrative hearing. So we know that judges were trained. We know that that seems to be schools that brought up scribes and judges, right? That there was a lawyer class that was more or less paid out of the surplus of the state that when it collects its taxes. So I want to make sure we understand, because I don't think it's appreciated enough, again, even in American critical race theory's circumstances, that your attachment to justice, your attachment to treating everyone fairly is linked to taxation. You either have the surplus, you have the tax revenue to support a state apparatus that is able to treat everyone fairly and justly, or you don't. Right, and when that is lacking, that's when those with power have more than the state, and their whim becomes stronger than the state. As a matter of fact, again, in the United States of America at this time, over the last 35 years, we have been engaging in what's called starve the beast tax policy, or at least conservatives have, to deprive the state of the revenue it needs to enforce Brown versus Board of Education and desegregation. You can't desegregate the schools unless you got money to have good schools to begin with, right? And see, now we see this public versus private split and other types of distinctions. In order for the EEOC and Department of Justice and others to enforce racial justice, gender equality, etc., etc., it has to have the funds to do it. And we see how not only will conservatives or those who want to control for private money in corporations and wealthy people to control instead of the general population, one of the ways to do it is to defund government or shut it down entirely, right? We just saw that. So justice is tied to taxation, and here's an interesting way it was done very specifically in ancient Egypt, is that justice, especially in the earliest times, and this is carried out throughout Africa, especially in the smaller states and the nomarchs, walk forth every day right, to dispense justice. So one of the ways in which justice was dispensed to the common person was not to have them come to court for the court to come to them. That either the pharaoh, the nomarch, or the vizier, somebody is required to just go about every day and allow the people to survey the land, but also allow those with disputes and appeals to approach the king or the ruler to tell them their problems, to hopefully have something resolved, or at least give it over to some bureaucratic officer to deal with. This is also part of taking the census. In a small polity, this was ideal every day, but that's an aspiration. In a larger state like Egypt, it was once a year. Right, go around to all the provinces to show again what power, might, pageantry, grandness, to know that this is the king, this is the pharaoh, but also on the way out to bring out them taxes to make sure you're paying your share, to know everything that we're belonging to the state. We're going to talk about there was an appeal system that went all the way up to the pharaoh, and then we also have evidence that there were queen mothers, and that we might even appeal all the way past the pharaoh to the queen mother. That is extraordinary, right? So we're going to try to find where we can get our evidence to push that notion forward, that the queen mother may have even been a higher authority when it comes to dispute making than the pharaoh at times. Justice is also represented by the tale of the eloquent peasant. This idea that the poor not only should have access to justice, but they should be treated fairly, or as was noted by John Wilson, impartially. Very important part of equal protection of the law and his commitment to due process. We also have, on top of the teachings of Ptahhotep, on top of the tale of the eloquent peasant, we also have lots of private law disputes and private law resolutions. It is very clear that ancient Egypt dealt with lots and lots and lots of contracts. There was even an archive, a national archive, that stored contracts and wills. So this is where we get scribes, lawyers, private law, and disputes, because then if property is not given over from one person to the next after death, then there's going to be a dispute about it. We're going to have to fight over whose land this is, whose property this is. And especially now that Egypt is getting wealthy through trade, and property is more than just the land you sit on, but property now becomes lots of things. Once we get gold coinage and money, how does those things pass? So we have a national archives to register contracts and to register wills, and what? An estate tax, right? To pay the state for the privilege of registering and respecting the transfer of property from one person to the next. And also the estate tax is also a means to make sure that wealth inequality stays in check, but that's a whole other thing. And an interesting thing that we'll talk about is that, again, when it comes to equal protection, women, we know through these contracts and contractual disputes, were equal persons in ancient Egypt. They were equal persons. They were not the property of their fathers or their husbands, that they could sue their husbands, they could sue their fathers for property that were owed to them. We even have, Aristide Theodorides details a legal dispute between a woman and her husband and their father for goods that he owes them or was promised to them in a will. Now, here's the thing. Here's the interesting thing about wills and contracts and the modernity of law in ancient Egypt. Sometimes the modernity of law, the modernity of Egypt, its greatness, its grandness, its wealth, worked against it. In other words, it attracted people from other places who felt a lesser sense of national identity, so that when problems arises, they're less apt to pitch in. They're more apt to call for different leadership and or different power structures, etc. And one of the ways in which we see African customs or African cultural unity and the transition from an African dominated South to a Mediterranean dominated North by after the New Kingdom and Asians preservation, we see different cultural transitions. We see matrilineal property succession change to patrilineal property succession, matriarchy to patriarchy. And the interesting thing is contracts and wills, as much as we can be proud about the modernity of ancient Egypt, this also facilitated the transition from an African cultural unity and matrilineality to patrilineality in this way. The default rules in property succession is that the property is owned by the Queen Mother, and it goes to from her to her sons, and that their property they don't particularly own, they manage for others, and so their property goes to their sisters' children, their nephews, right? It's all going down the female line. It's going down the female line. So if you as a man accumulate wealth and power and land, cattle and whatnot, it goes to your sister's children, especially intestate, right? That's the African custom, right? Mother's baby, papa's maybe, right? We don't without paternity tests, we're not even sure those kids are yours, right? That's the question. And it'd be very interesting to do a family law segment. How would family law look under a matrilineal system, right? Child support for the uncles instead of the supposed father. It's really interesting. But anyway, going back to the switch over the 3,000 years from the African interior Old Kingdom to more patrilineal and a Mediterranean dominated cultural systems 3,000 years later, wills and archives, wills and contracts facilitate this, because that default intestate transition of power and money through the Queen Mother can be abrogated through the will. So instead of just custom involved, I trump custom. I trump custom by having a will that says, I as a man have this property, and even if it's not real property, I have this type of wealth, and I'm transferring it by contract, by will, to my sons, to my eldest son, or to whomever I choose. And that way, we have people from outside of Egypt, when they grant power, and again, it's very political about marriage, creating a union with African, particularly African women, and then once in control of that wealth, passing it on to sons who have a greater allegiance to those in the north or outside of Egypt than they do to Egypt itself. These are things that helped create less loyalty in the intermediate periods where we have the Hyksos or the Sea Peoples who would not dominate Egypt for certain periods, but then in the 11th dynasty marching up from the south to reclaim Egypt, or again the 18th dynasty going up from the south to reclaim Egypt for the African interior, or the 25th dynasty going up from the south, reclaiming Egypt for its African interior and reinstituting African cultural customs, especially legal customs, including matriarchy and matrilineality. Okay, we're going to take a break here. Tomorrow in episode 4, we'll probably continue down this vein. Maybe we'll be a little more specific about the trial of Horus and trial of Set, the negative confessions as presented by Asa Hilliard. I want to talk a little more specifically about the teachings of Ptah-hotep. I'm so impressed by, again, his text on administrative law hearings, the first concept of the hearing. It bears a lot more note. And then we'll also talk about the tale of the eloquent peasant and some other stories that are in Egyptian jurisprudence through stories of how people are treated as parables on how they ought to be treated, how this equal protection of law permeates the texts that we found that describe Egypt and their political systems. So we'll break here. Again, please go to, if you're on YouTube watching this, or if you're watching it on Facebook, please go to the YouTube channel and subscribe to Afrolantica.com. please go to Amazon Kindle and buy the book Taxes, Death, and Trouble: How Starve the Beast Tax Cuts Created the Black Lives Matter Movement. Again, that's Taxes, Death, and Trouble: How Starve the Beast Tax Cuts Created the Black Lives Matter Movement. And for that, say goodbye and say better educate ourselves and our children, start and patronize black businesses, stop unduly criticizing each other. Let's accumulate human, financial, social, and political capital. Hotep.